Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ANU. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for making time to be with us at the Southeast Asia Institute's 2025 Regional Geo-Economic Update. Please let me begin in the customary manner by celebrating and acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. We pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and remember that we are meeting on unceded land. Today, it's a great pleasure here to also welcome the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the ANU, Professor Helen SULLIVAN. Helen has the unenviable task of looking after the college, which, in principle gathers scholars looking after this large and extremely varied region. And we're very, very happy that she's made some time in her schedule to open the update for us today. So please let me welcome Professor SULLIVAN to make some opening remarks. Helen.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And I begin with an apology. I've been struck down with a virus, which is a consequence of spending time in Melbourne. So I would strongly advise you to not go anywhere near Melbourne. But it's a great delight to be here to open this event and to just see all of the extraordinary colleagues, friends, interested parties, people from government, people from the not-for-profit sector, as well as academics, coming together to talk about some of these extraordinarily important issues. I too would like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the first Australians on whose traditional lands and airways we meet, we live, we work, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. It's, as I say, a very great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the Australian National University and to the 2025 Southeast Asia Regional Geo-Economic Update. I've been practicing that. It's not the easiest phrase to say. As I indicated, I think we have colleagues here from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Thank you all for your continued support. We could not do what we do in this college without your continuing support, and we really appreciate it. Now, as many of you will know, the ANU is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Asia and the Pacific. And here at the College of Asia and the Pacific, we host 11 regional institutes and centres. And the purpose of these institutes is to help foster greater collaboration between academics and the policy community through our scholarly activities and partnerships. And I know many, many of you have been involved in our institutes in one way or another for some time. And the flagship update events, like the one we're having today, play a pivotal role in building this collaboration and engagement. And before I go on to talk about today's event and the Southeast Asia Institute's Geo-Economic Update, I just want to make a couple of points about what we do here and how important it is. As people sometimes get very tired of hearing, I know in Canberra and especially in other parts of Australia, we are the national university. We are the only national university, and we are the only university with a mandate built into our founding principles, which is about helping Australia understand itself and its place in our region. And as Evelyn's indicated, this region is the most dynamic, possibly the most important region at the moment and into our short and medium-term futures. So developing an understanding of that, an appreciation of that, and acknowledging our role in that is incredibly important. Some of you may also be aware that Parliament under Tim Ayres is holding an inquiry at the moment, a regular inquiry. I'm sure some of you have seen them before, into Asia capability in Australia. We're still calling it that. I've been in Australia since 2011, and at that time there was the publication of something called Australia in the Asian Century, which is a report that, yeah, some of you will remember. You can't actually find it on the website anymore. But this, as many of you will know, is a rehearsal of something that we go through repeatedly, and we actually don't ever seem to do anything about. As usual, our fantastic colleagues in the college have led important submissions to the current inquiry and will be speaking to that inquiry tomorrow. And one of the things that we will be saying is not only underscoring the importance of teaching languages in and of our region, of building a deep understanding in and of our region, but also, as you would expect us to, the particular role that the ANU plays in acting as a focal point, a convener, an integrator. And, if you want to put it plainly, the place that does things where nobody else does them because nobody else can afford to do them. And that is the sorry state we find ourselves in relation to many of our languages, and I'm afraid to say, in many of the other important disciplines that go into understanding our region. And one of the reasons we can do that, and I make no apology for emphasizing this to this group of people, one of the reasons we do that is because the Commonwealth Government gives us money that it doesn't give to any other university. That is represented often as money that that could be better spent elsewhere. Maybe it could. But for us, in this college, the College of Asia and the Pacific, the only kind of institution in the world like this, that money is foundational for us. Without that money, we would not be able to teach most of the things we teach. And even with that money, we teach languages, important languages, with barely 1 or 2 people responsible for them. So in the great melee of things people are talking about the ANU at the moment, most of which is, you know, not the kind of publicity you would want, it's really important for me as the current steward of this fabulous college to remind people at every possible opportunity that just as the School of Music is an invaluable asset to the Canberra community, the College of Asia and the Pacific, the regional institutes, the departments and the schools that we have that spend their time dedicated to deep, long-term inquiry so that we can advise government ministers, government departments, policy officials, private sector leaders on what's really going on. All of that is done by virtue of the fact that we are the national university and we get given some funding to support that. But it needs defending. And the very fact that we are having another inquiry is evidence of how important it is that people who are able to defend the kind of work that is done here do so. And it's also important because one of the reasons we are able to attract people of the extraordinary caliber of Professor Evelyn Goh and many others is because of the promise that the ANU makes to being the place where you come and you understand, and we give you time and space and access to do the wonderful work that you do. And we spend a lot of our time, I spend a lot of my time, trying to remind people why it is that the ANU is so special. Because people like Evelyn and many other colleagues in this room are constantly and the suggestion from other parts of the world that maybe, you know, why on earth be in Australia where you could be somewhere else that's more central? And the reason, well, Evelyn will speak for herself, but what I understand from colleagues is the reason they want to be here is because of what we do, because of the diversity of scholarship, because of the range of expertise and the disciplines, and the fact that we do real scholarly work with real policy impact. And my job is to try and defend and promote and advocate for that. So thank you for listening to my mini treatise on why it is that these events, your participation, are so important in keeping our knowledge, our expertise, and our understanding of what is going on in the most important region in the world is so important. And of course, it is a region, particularly Southeast Asia at the moment, that is experiencing a terrible tragedy. At least 1,000 people have died as a result of a confluence of weather events that are always talked about as being unusual, but appear to happen with regularity. And I know that you'll be dealing with some issues connected to that today. So today's update is especially timely given that the most significant threats and challenges facing our region this year have been mainly economic, starting with Trump's tariff shocks. The update is also distinctive in addressing the sub-region of Southeast Asia as a whole and exploring themes spanning multiple Southeast Asian countries, so complementing the series of country-focused updates that we also run. And this event today is a great addition to the inaugural regional geopolitical update that Professor Goh and her team convened in May 2023. And despite everything that's been going on at the university, the team have managed to maintain the energy to keep going despite the many challenges we've faced. So in May this year, the Southeast Asia Institute hosted the very first ANU Southeast Asia Institute's plenary, bringing together colleagues from our Indonesia Institute, Malaysia Institute, Myanmar Research Centre, and the Philippines Institute to present what turned out to be a fascinating discussion on the rules-based order, Southeast Asia in the age of the deal. This year has also seen the continuation of Southeast Asia Institute's research seminar series, convened by the extraordinarily talented Dr. Nicholas Chan and Dr. Deepak Nair. If you don't know them, make it your business to know them. They are quite remarkable scholars. And we're very lucky to have them here. And speakers at that event addressed a wide range of topics, including geo-economics, which is a term I actually hate, but that apparently I don't get to decide. We can have a conversation about why I hate it. The election in Singapore and the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. So thank you all for supporting our various events throughout the year and for being here today. It means so much to us. I would also like to express my gratitude to everyone involved in organising this event, particularly Professor Evelyn Goh, who's the director of the Southeast Asia Institute, Dr. Nicholas Chan, the deputy director and the convener of this update, and lastly Yan Hong Huang, the regional institute's coordinator from the college partnerships team, without whom I should say, nothing would ever happen. We all dread the day that Yan Hong decides she's had enough of us and is going to go off and do something else. So please, if you get the opportunity to persuade her that this is the place to be, take that opportunity. And I really appreciate the time and the effort that has gone into making this event possible. Evelyn is now going to give you an insight into today's programme. I'm going to stay until the end of this session, but then I'm going to go because nobody wants what I've got. But I really wanted to be here to open the session and to welcome you today. Thank you all for coming and have a great day.
Does that work? Can you hear me as though I'm not shouting at you? Okay. Thanks very much, Helen. In the spirit of not catching Helen's germs. I'm going to use a microphone from here instead. Um, thanks, Helen, and we're delighted at the Southeast Asia Institute to give you a platform to once again reiterate the importance of the work that we do here at the College of Asia and the Pacific. For who are not at the ANU, thank you for taking time to be here with us, and thank you for your patience in, bearing with us as we deal with our clearly rather overwhelming difficulties at the moment. Look, we're here today to talk about geoeconomics, which is also not one of my favorite terms. What we have done is to adopt geoeconomics as a theme, but not an unquestioned theme in these discussions that we're going to have for the rest of today. In part, this is because it is a nice and logical to the geopolitical update, which we held nicely and quite successfully, I think, in 2023, and which I think served its purpose of stimulating a variety of useful conversations, both in the policy and in the academic realms, which have persisted since May of 2023. So what we're hoping is that the geoeconomics discussions that we'll have today will have a similar impact. Now, geoeconomics has officially become a thing in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, as many of you will know. How does something officially become a thing in ASEAN? It gets adopted into the ASEAN lexicon. And this has as one of the few collective responses to the Trump tariffs was the establishment of the ASEAN Geo-Economics Task Force, convened first in May this year. So now that the word is in the ASEAN lexicon, we at least have a signaling of efforts in the region to take ownership of this concept, always in any kind of policy advance in the region collectively. And we will see what eventuates from here. But this is the starting point that I think we can, take in our discussions today. Of course, our substantive focus, regardless of whether you like the term geoeconomics, is on that nexus of economics and security. Now, for some of us who've been working on this sort of thing for a while, that's the old chestnut, right? How are the two things connected? How economy, take an interest in broader geostrategic, geopolitical trends, and how do those of us who are strategists or political scientists, take sufficient amount of account the big systemic economic trends which are going on that fundamentally shape realms of possibilities and impossibility in politics. So that nexus of economics and security would be, for someone like Helen, I think, alternative way of thinking about what we're going to talk about today that's not off-putting, I hope. Of course, when we think about that nexus, there is a tendency, apparently, to start from opposing observations, right? On the one hand, located in Australia, it's quite natural for us to think, well, the relationship between these two things is obvious. Economics follows security, right? That's the one way of thinking about it. And it comes out of countries, politicians that have a history of choosing the one great and powerful ally who happens to be both the economic and security provider. So the idea that economics simply follows security choices. On the opposing side of that spectrum is the idea that economics can be separated or are separate from security. And we see many, many expressions of this. One is the claim that Southeast Asians can have and eat it too, between the US as a security provider and China as its key economic. Yeah, this a lot. Now, for those of us studying Southeast Asia, I would say that the most really characterization of the economic security nexus might be and we have technological failures. Southeast Asia. Mics aside, yes. In contrast to the two ways of thinking about it I've briefly sketched, I would suggest that the take on this in Southeast Asia, on this nexus in Southeast Asia, goes something along the following lines: that economics fundamentally is the fuel, right, that fuels the vehicle of state, right? If one likes to think of strategy as the driving of a state vehicle, you know, along a certain path. Economics ensures that the vehicle can move in the first place and that the state or the regime is viable in the first place. Of course, what the destination or route might be or might evolve into after that is driven by a series of political choices or compromises, which is determined in turn by combinations of security and economics logics. But economics is the fuel of the vehicle of the state. Now, why am I sort of, you know, belaboring this point? I'm saying this because I think it's quite important to get our heads around where we stand on how we think the relationship between economics and security works before we leap into what is currently fashionable and apparently urgent to think about, right? And what's the context of the current debates? It goes something along the following lines. Because of the combined pressures of US, China decoupling, de-risking, because of the pandemic, because of the vulnerabilities exposed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is an expectation, of course, of rising interstate rivalry and the potential for conflict. Generally, when we think about this from Southeast Asia, we are fairly accustomed to the idea that economic security is a fundamental aspect of security, cast fairly broadly, right? Thinking about politics, environment, social security, etc., other aspects achieved that might be achieved through pursuing economic prosperity. With the growing risk of geopolitical disruption, what we're getting is a turn to focus more narrowly on securing supply chains, ensuring economic resilience in the face of geopolitical adversity. We are seeing claims, for example, that the liberal free trade principles are being replaced by a policy focus on dual-use technology controls, on investment screening, sector-specific tariffs, industrial policy in pursuit of national security. This is sort of, you know, generally, not just in Southeast Asia. Of course, when we think about these challenges from a vantage point in Southeast Asia, none of them seem like a terribly new change, right? State-centered economic developmentalist policies in Southeast Asia have traditionally used industrial policy. It is not a new thing, for example, in this region, the way it might be a new thing in other parts of the world. There have always been a range of import-export controls, direct or indirect, in spite of the benefits and enthusiasms about free trade. So it leads us to think about the extent to which there are reifications of some existing trends as well as signs of new trends. So it will be a mix of the two. Now, it's with that in mind that the focus of this update today is on three themes, which we will organize across the three panels in a logical way. We're going to think about realignments, resources, and risks. It's nice alliteration. And I want to thank Nick for coming up with these three R's in the first place and conceptualizing this. Under realignments, we'd like to think about the extent to which Southeast Asian countries and societal actors best maintain their developmental imperatives in light of these systemic challenges. Secondly, we ask, ought they try to balance a variety of opportunities and risks in different ways across domestic and foreign economic, social, and strategic policies. We've asked the question in terms of balance because very few things in Southeast Asia are zero-sum choices. They're all about balancing apparently irreconcilable things. And finally, how will Southeast Asian political economies ensure the security of critical supply chains and technology? So we're going to ask these questions in a sort of big to focused way. And we've asked our speakers variously to address these. As a final word, it is of course my great pleasure to thank our speakers and chairs for the program today. We're very, very happy at the Institute that for this event, we've got a 50-50 representation of ANU colleagues as well as speakers from outside of the ANU and from the region. I'm particularly grateful, of course, for our friends and colleagues who have come from the region and for taking the time to travel to us and to spend this time with us in person. I'm also grateful for the 5 ANU colleagues who've given up their time. This is a very intense part of the year for those of us who've been teaching particularly, and those of us running large projects as well. So I'm very grateful for your help. These 5 ANU colleagues are all part of Southeast Asia Institute's working committee or advisory board. So they are stepping up to showcase our immense expertise in these areas as well. So thank you very much. I will turn over to the chair of the first panel on realignments. At this stage, we might have to get people down, etc. And thank you for your time in hearing me through on these opening remarks. And I hope that the program sends to you as it does to me and Nick. Thank you very much, and really looking forward to your active participation in the discussions that we'll have for the rest of this morning and this afternoon. Thank you. Did you want to use that? It's up to you.
Hi, thank you, Evelyn, and thank you, Helen, for very kindly kickstarting the update. I'll sort of try to say the word geo-economics a little bit less. I'm Nicholas Chan. Can you hear me well? I'm the Deputy Director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute, and I'll be happily chairing this panel. This panel is on realignments, as Evelyn mentioned, and I really like this idea of realignments in plural because it helps transcend this image of geo-economics just being about siding with one side or the other, basically guessing which way the wind is blowing for each country, basically. For me, realignments conjure a different image. This image of a Rubik's Cube, where at each level you can make multiple twists. And often when you make a twist at one level, you have to twist it on a different level to align things, to make things make sense. So you have multiple moves and possibilities, right? So it seems very endless. And of course, the mosaic one sees as an unsolved Rubik's Cube is very much the de facto geo-economics landscape that Evelyn mentioned that most Southeast Asia states have to control, navigate. Perhaps some does so in more interesting or challenging ways than the others. So to help us really unpack this Rubik's Cube that I mentioned, we have 3 distinguished experts with us today that I have the great pleasure of introducing. In the interest of time, I'll be using an abridged version of their bios, but you can check out their full bios in our event booklet. The first speaker would be Professor Helen NESADURAI, who's a professor of international political economy at Monash University of Malaysia. Her research focuses on the intersection of global, regional, and transnational governance, architectures, and mechanisms in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific. Her recent publications include Economic Statecraft, Geo-Economics, and Regional Political Economies in East Asia with Sean Breslin with the Pacific Review 2023, and Malaysia as an ambivalent middle power, reconceptualizing geo-economics from a global south perspective, published with Global Policy in 2025. I had the pleasure of recently read that paper, the second paper, and really would recommend it to everyone here. Dr. Wu Tan Tuan served as the Dean of the Fulbright School of Public Policy and Management at Fulbright University, Vietnam from 2017 to 2024, leading its transformation into the first public policy institution in Southeast Asia to earn accreditation from NASPRA of the United States. His main research political interest research interest is political economy of development. And he is an author in 2 recent edited volumes about Vietnam. First, Vietnam Navigating a Rapidly Changing Economy, Society and Political Order, Harvard University Press, and the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Vietnam. Professor Evelyn Goh is the Shadden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies at the ANU. And she's also the director, as you know, of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute. Evelyn is a scholar specializing in security and international relations in East Asia. She has published extensively on US-China and China-Japan relations, both historical and contemporary, and advanced new theorizing on power, order, and change in international relations. Her original research and conceptualization of Southeast Asian strategies towards great power remain influential, and she was also one of the earliest scholars to study post-Cold War transboundary environmental security in the Lancang Mekong River Basin. So basically some house rules. Each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes for presentation. I'll try to wave from you from that little corner of mine if you have only like 3 minutes left. So do maintain some eye contact with me. But because I have to sit there to see the slides. But please join me to welcome first Professor NESADURAI.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that very kind welcome. You can hear me, right? Okay, great. I was going to say, well, I traveled from Malaysia, and last week it was really cold. People were wearing 2 layers because cyclone in the North Straits of Malacca. And I was going to say how nice it is to be in warm Canberra, but I don't think I can say that today. So I'd like to thank Evelyn and her fellow conveners and organizers for inviting me to present at this year's Southeast Asia Geo-Economic Update and to speak to the 2 questions that the conveners have posed for this panel. So I think that the most pressing geo-economic challenge facing the trade and investment dependent economies of Southeast Asia is, no surprise, the US-China conflict, which is inextricably linked this year to Washington's efforts to make America great again, and while simultaneously containing China. And in 2025, this conflict is manifested and escalated through the unilateral US tariffs and the agreements negotiated by affected governments to lower those tariffs, which could end up constraining their economic security choices, because as Evelyn has reminded us, economics is security in Southeast Asia. I will explain a little bit further by focusing on 2 recently concluded agreements in Southeast Asia signed with the US, the agreement on reciprocal tariffs signed individually by Malaysia and Cambodia in October of this year. So I'll highlight key elements from these agreements and then suggest what these mean for the 3 realignments set out as question 2 for this panel: great power relationships, domestic state-society relations, and the trade-offs between economic gain and security concerns. So Southeast Asia, as you know, was not spared Washington's unilateral tariff imposition. We have substantial tariffs, as you can see from this slide. And governments began negotiations soon after they received word of the applicable tariffs. And the negotiations seemingly paid off. The Malaysia-US Agreement on Reciprocal Tariffs, ART, or ART, was signed by US President Donald Trump and Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim on the side of the ASEAN Summit in October 2025, when President Trump also signed a similar art with Cambodia. So what was the art of the deal? I have to say that. It's just too good to miss. Let me use the case of Malaysia as an illustration, and then I will refer to the Cambodian agreement to highlight a couple of interesting differences. So what does Malaysia gain? Aside from the reduction in the overall tariff from 25% to 19%, up to about 12% of Malaysia's exports to the US, which is about 1,711 tariff lines, may be eligible for a reciprocal tariff rate that's lower than 19%, possibly even 0%, across key export sectors for Malaysia, for instance, aircraft components, spare parts, pharmaceuticals, cocoa products, rubber-based products, and palm oil. Now, in addition to addressing its tariffs and non-tariff barriers, Malaysia is expected to facilitate up to US 70 billion in US job-creating investments across services, infrastructure, technology, and critical minerals over 5 years. And this includes a commitment to purchase US equipment for high-tech sectors in aerospace, semiconductors, data centers, and also commercial procurements of up to 1 trillion Malaysian ringgit of US LNG and commercial aircraft. And this is apparently the already decided commercial expansion plans by Petronas and the Malaysian Aviation Group. And Malaysia also commits not to impose restrictions on strategic minerals and rare earth exports to the US. And in return, Malaysia is deemed a comprehensive, strategic, and trusted supply chain trade partner, which reportedly can bring the country access to strategic and high-tech goods important for the country's new industrial master plan. So despite these gains, the agreement has proved extremely controversial in Malaysia. Almost immediately after signing it, the Malaysian Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry had to defend the agreement, explaining in Parliament that the government had had no choice but to negotiate the agreement or face disruptions across several vital economic sectors, given that the US remains a top export market. Without the agreement, there would be no guarantee that tariffs would not be further raised, perhaps even to 100% or beyond. The minister reiterated, however, that key red lines for Malaysia had not been traded away. Red lines include Malaysia's Bumiputra ethnic affirmative action policies, halal standards, which are important to retain market credibility for Malaysia's globally significant Islamic economy, and also equity control in strategic sectors. And to the barrage of criticisms from several Malaysian politicians, political parties, and civil society groups that Malaysia had conceded too much in the agreement, the minister pointed out that the agreement contains clauses that recognize Malaysia's national sovereignty and economic security concerns, while also maintaining that implementation will be in accordance with domestic laws and mutually acceptable timelines. But when you read the agreement, this does not seem to be really the case. What seems clear is that Malaysia and Cambodia are expected to cooperate with US export control and sanctions regimes, and so aligning with Washington's strategic interests. For instance, in Section 3, Article 3.3 requires Malaysia and Cambodia to consult the US before signing any new digital trade agreement with another country that jeopardizes, and I'm quoting from the agreement, essential US interests. And then Article 5.1 commits Malaysia and Cambodia to adopt equivalent sanctions, taxes, prohibitions, and so on that the US might impose on a third country if Washington deems them necessary to protect US national and economic security. In denying that Article 5.1 commits Malaysia to follow US sanctions against other countries, both the minister and the prime minister pointed out that Malaysia has an exit clause, while potential sanction action would involve negotiations between the US and Malaysia. But it's not really clear what this exit clause is, how it would operate, and whether it might bring retaliations if adopted. And also the wording suggests that the mentioned negotiations are more to agree on a timeline for implementation acceptable to both sides rather than a substantive choice. And so these commitments are actually quite a deviation from Prime Minister Anwar's previous stance when former US President Biden imposed sanctions on Russia. He made the point that Malaysia would only follow UN-led sanctions adopted through international law and multilateral processes rather than unilateral impositions. If you look at some of the commentary coming out from international trade lawyers and law firms, they note that the two agreements, Malaysia and Cambodia, are binding international agreements in form and substance, but most of the hard obligations seem to fall on Malaysia and Cambodia, while the US is mostly committed to soft obligations, for instance, through phrases like to work with, to consider, and so on. But there is one hard US obligation that's a crucial one, and that is it will adopt the reciprocal tariff agreement without needing congressional approval. And one of the law firms, Baker Botts, uses the phrase, and I quote, unprecedented obligation when speaking of the articles that require Cambodia and Malaysia to follow the US lead on certain matters related to economic and national security, which I pointed out in the previous slide. Interestingly, the Cambodian agreement contains a specific qualifier that limits Cambodia to acting, and I'm quoting again, in a manner that does not infringe on Cambodia's sovereign interests, while the Malaysian agreement contains no such sovereignty qualifier. So what I've done so far is to sketch out the geo-economic state of play from what we see through these agreements. Its annexes and articles, the early interpretations and the surmises, and it's still early days, so we should pay attention to how these agreements unfold on the ground. But to the extent that this sketch is broadly correct, what are the agreement's implications? Taking the Malaysia agreement, the Malaysia-US agreement, for instance, Malaysia seems to have been presented with a Hobson's choice, essentially no real choice, given that the short-run costs if tariffs of 25% or even higher are unilaterally imposed. Critics have argued that no Malaysian prime minister has ever conceded so much sovereignty to another country. The word traitorous was used by former Prime Minister Mahathir. Realistically, the current context is unique. It was a matter of time that the countries would be pushed to take sides. Plus, no other post-war US president, I believe, has moved to upend the multilateral trading system, unilaterally impose tariffs against allies, and then demand concessions, or else face even higher tariffs. And I don't think this was true even during the 1980s US-Japan trade conflict. Even though there is informal talk that elements of the agreement may lapse if US entities cannot fulfill the procurement orders or if situations change, it's clear we still need to examine what the agreement means in terms of the realignments that Evelyn mentioned. So as it stands, the agreement is likely to constrain multi-alignment. This is a strategy that Professor Cheng Chui Quick argues Malaysia and several Southeast Asian countries already pursue, albeit to varying degrees, and which was expected to expand given rising risks and uncertainties in global and regional geopolitics, and considering Southeast Asia's declining trust in the US. So while ASEAN countries rationally engage with the US to lower the imposed tariffs, which can hurt deeply in the short run, any rational longer run strategy to reinforce multi-alignment and economic diversification may prove difficult if the agreement is indeed what the deal is all about. Also in October 2025, at the 28th ASEAN-China Summit in Kuala Lumpur, both sides signed an updated China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, now known as CAFTA 3.0. Following 2 or 3 years of negotiations, there are 9 new chapters, and that look at supply chains, supply chain connectivity, and also the digital and green economies, which are areas of special importance to regional economies that have committed to future digital and green economy growth strategies. Anwar, as ASEAN 2025 chair, hailed CAFTA as a vital strategic development in ASEAN-China relations that contributes to the region's collective resilience. But the question is whether CAFTA and the US tariff agreements clash, if so, by how much, and how will this impact on hedging and multi-alignment, especially as Southeast Asian countries have generally aligned more to China in economics and to the US in security, or rather that China is really the country that they prefer to align with in terms of economics. But just last week, China expressed grave concerns to both the Malaysian and Cambodian governments and asked for clarification on some aspects of these agreements. But so far, we haven't heard what was discussed. And relevant to this story is also the recent reminder of the US ambassador to Malaysia that certain red lines, he reminded Malaysia of certain red lines that President Trump would not tolerate, and BRICS has been mentioned as one of these. Malaysia is currently awaiting full membership into the BRICS, part of the country's multi-alignment strategy. And the ambassador added that Malaysia's economic and national security is best served tied to Western supply chains. So there's much to watch in this space in terms of how Southeast Asian countries go about managing or realigning their great power relations, if indeed the Malaysian agreement is a portent of things to come. Moving on to the other two realignments. The domestic trade and investment reform aspects of the agreement could offer countries like Malaysia opportunities to realize economic efficiencies and access to high-tech purchases. The US tariffs are tied to Malaysia's tariff and especially its non-tariff barriers. And to the extent that these reforms create economic opportunities, unleash efficiencies within countries, they can have a positive effect on generalized state-society relations and thereby on domestic regime security. Economic performance and the delivery of generalized material welfare for citizens and residents still remains a crucial basis of political legitimacy across Southeast Asia. But in the Malaysian case, at least, there is now a political headache for Prime Minister Anwar, especially amongst the crucial Malay electorate. His seeming capitulation to the US and departure from Malaysia's long-standing approach to an equidistant foreign policy and especially economic diversification. What do these agreements mean for the traditional division between economic gains and security concerns? The Southeast Asian countries have been rather pragmatic in their responses to concerns arising from China's incursions and other activities in the South China Sea. For instance, most of them wanting or trying to avoid megaphone diplomacy, and with several preferring to see China as a longer-term development partner, so in a way separating economic gains from security risks. There may be some states that welcome an imposed realignment to the US on the grounds that they simply could not escape, hoping to soften any displeasure from China. But Beijing has been very clear that countries should not shut out China, which offers them a development partnership, to quote Chinese officials, rather than dictate terms. And crucial to note is that the overall regional strategic environment previously, before the mid to late 2010s, I think allowed for such a separation of economics from security, so enabling hedging, multi-alignment, and so on. But that may not be true anymore. The geopolitical or superpower conflict has explicitly become a conflict in which security and economics are intertwined, reflected in the agreements. So let me conclude by offering some tentative conclusions, just three. One, if the tariff deals with the US are like the Malaysian one, They may not offer Southeast Asian countries reciprocity, but rather present them with Hobson's choice. Two, regional states could see limited room to reduce longer-run economic reliance on the United States. And three, that Southeast Asian states must play the geo-economic game, not in the shadows as previously, but in the open theater. And I will end there. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank Evelyn and Nick for giving me the opportunity to be here today. My presentation is about navigating geo-economic realignment in ASEAN, and I'm going to talk about two major aspects of it, which is one is the dilemmas facing ASEAN, and two is some emerging opportunities, because today's many people just talk about the multi-crisis or poly-crisis, but I would like to talk also about opportunity as well. So in my presentation, I'm going to discuss three topics. One is I'm going to talk about ASEAN's geo-economic strategic dilemma, and then I'm going to turn into the geo-economic realignments from Vietnam perspective, because I think that is important to illustrate my point in the first slide about the dilemma facing ASEAN with some concrete example from a country in ASEAN. And in this part, I'm going to talk about the realignment in terms of international trade, investment, and the restructuring of global value chains, which are very important for Vietnam in particular and for ASEAN more generally. And then I'm going to talk about the multipolar fragmentation and the associated opportunities given to ASEAN countries. So first, I'm going to talk about, 7 dilemmas, but I'm not going to go into detail, but just to mention it because I think it's important to see both the opportunity and challenges facing ASEAN in the new geopolitical and geo-economics environments. And this presentation will discuss how ASEAN can navigate a world where great power rivalry is intensifying, global value chains are restructuring, and technological and climate transition are reshaping competitiveness. And then I'm going to talk both about the dilemmas and the opportunities, especially arising from China plus one, from the tension between the US and China, from the new geopolitical and geo-economic realignment of great powers and so on. And at this crossroads, I think the key question is how ASEAN can convert short-term geo-economic opportunity into long-term structural upgrading. I think from economic perspective, that is a key question that I think Vietnam in particular and other ASEAN countries is considering. And my remarks today will examine these dilemmas, the realignments driving them, and the strategic opportunity that lie ahead. And so, these are the 7 dilemmas that I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm going to illustrate these 7 dilemmas by looking at the specific case of Vietnam. So if you look at this slide, I'm going to use, similar to what Nick said, is the rubric, cube, the 3 layers, 3-level games that a country like Vietnam and ASEAN country are dealing with. The first one is global shifts with many challenges, be they geopolitical shifts, economic factors, disruptive technology, disruptive events like COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, And of course, we should talk about climate change as well. The bottom line of this is um, the end of a golden age, peaceful and relatively rule-based hyper-globalizations. So that's ended. I don't think it's not going to continue in the same manner as we observed earlier, with or without Trump, right? Uh, and then a relatively less discussed about is the country dynamics because it's more internal to each country. And here, from Vietnam perspective, I see Vietnam and certainly Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand as well increasingly see themselves as middle powers, but falling into middle income traps. So that is a critical, observation if you really want to understand those countries and their behavior. And for example, in Vietnam, for a long time, we managed to maintain a relatively high growth rate of 6.5 to 7%. And this year, it's going to be 8%, according to the official statistics. And a consequence of that is the decreasing return on investment kicks in. And therefore, it's really hard to maintain the similar level of growth with the same level of investment. We really need to increase investment. And that's exactly where we get into problem because we need to attract a lot of FDI and we depend so much on FDI as the other slides in my presentation illustrates. And again, another problem is aging population. ASEAN is aging, and that's make it even harder, to maintain independence and maintain a vibrancy in the economy, when you have aging population. And clearly, our colleagues here in the panel talk about security concerns, and I agree completely with Evelyn that economics is actually security for the country in ASEAN. The point here is, given this country dynamics, there's a re-emergence and reintroduction of industrial policy. Industrial policy used to be the taboo, right? Especially in the view of Washington consensus, but now it's returning. Not only for China, not only for South Korea, but for the US, for EU, for UK, and of course for ASEAN countries. And this has a huge consequences for Vietnam and ASEAN's economy because, for example, you will see the newly emerged industrial policy will reshape the relationship between state and business, between state and society. For example, in the case of Vietnam, now private conglomerates earn the upper hands vis-a-vis small and medium-sized enterprises. Because why? Because the government want to foster high economic growth. What is the easiest and fastest way to do it? Pump money to state-owned enterprises and, well politically connected private firms, right, with political capital. So small and medium-sized enterprise will not be, paid sufficient attention to foster their growth. So like what I said, it has a huge consequences. And of course, the consequences of economic upgrading, and for countries in ASEAN, they all depends very much on foreign direct investment and export. And here is exactly where we are caught between the tension between China and the US and the great power politics. And of course, in Vietnam uses that, the so-called bamboo diplomacy to facilitate this, try to maintain the balance between great powers, but it's not easy, right? And to be clear, bamboo diplomacy is not invented by Vietnam, but actually invented by Thailand, right? For the long term, for the long time, but we just use this. And then in between the global shift and country dynamics, there's regional and multinational, realignment as well. Of course, for example, when Biden visited Vietnam 2 years ago, suddenly Vietnam find a space in developing semiconductor. But with Trump taking office, we don't see that space is wide open compared to the Biden administration. So things like that shifting all the time. And as the smaller countries, we have little choice but following and like adopting and adapting that kind of environments. And again, uh, the global value chains is restructuring, and the role of MNCs is huge. Think about it like Samsung. Samsung alone account for nearly 20% of Vietnam total export. And when Samsung get into trouble, Vietnam export get into trouble, and even GDP will decline. So that is something that I think very important to understand, the ASEAN economy, because it depends so much on the restructuring of global value chains and on the MSC's strategy. And of course, the effort of regionalizations. We talk about ASEAN, we talk about, ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, and CP, TPP, and so on and so forth. But, you know, today we are talking about Southeast Asia, and I want to emphasize that when Trump imposes reciprocal tariffs on the world, and for ASEAN, the first thing for most ASEAN leaders is not to get together to discuss how to, counter that, reciprocal tariff, but how to get into the light to talk privately with Trump. That is a big problem. Right? We really want to see stronger ASEANs, but if the incentives, the motivation, and the behavior of ASEAN leaders are, going, like bilateral with the US to gain the upper hand in the negotiation with the US, then ASEAN is in big trouble. I think this is something we need to fix. And of course, in terms of global value chains, there's a lot of emphasis not only on efficiency, but on resilience, on de-risking, on sustainability, and on ESG. So this is a new thing that's coming up, and it's a big challenge for relatively small and poorer economy like ASEAN. Okay, so this is my framework. Okay, now I'm going to go to the specific case of Vietnam. I'm going to go quickly because I know that I only have about 10 minutes left. First of all, Vietnam and ASEAN have been very active in joining free trade agreements, and you can see, all the regional agreements. And if you put into this picture, the fact that Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia are trying to get into BRICS, right? Indonesia is officially member of BRICS, and Vietnam, as Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand are like partners of BRICS, and then OECD. So we really try to counter and to diversify. Basically that is the strategy that all ASEAN countries are doing. And then all of ASEAN countries rely a lot on export and FDIs. So, and Vietnam is kind of an outlier because in the last 2 decades, we managed to maintain a double-digit export growth, and I think Vietnam economy has been able to maintain a high rate of growth because of exports and foreign direct investment. And as a result, our export basket has been transformed completely, and this is a picture about the export basket in 2005 and 2023. So in 2005, the top 3 exports of Vietnam are crude oil, textile, and footwear. These 3 top exports back in 2005 are no longer the top export in 2023, which are electronics, cell phone, and machineries and equipments and so on. So really, export has transformed Vietnam. FDI has transformed Vietnam economy. But then, the big trouble is we depend so much on FDI. This is my favorite slide. 30 years ago, foreign direct investment account for only a quarter of Vietnam's total export. Today, 3/4 come from FDI. So the reversing role of domestic sector and foreign sector is so vivid in Vietnamese case. And this is a big problem because we rely too much on external FDI and export. And, I mentioned about sustainability and ESG earlier, and Vietnam is a country where export related CO2 emission is high. Actually, it's like off the chart. It's like an outlier. And dealing with this, given the fact that the Prime Minister of Vietnam committed in COP26 of net zero by 2050, it's a huge task. I don't know how they will achieve that, right? But this is the fact that we need to deal with. And again, now I'm going to talk about global value chains restructuring. So the question is it restructuring or is it transshipment? This is a big, question between Vietnam and the US. Because if you look at the data, for example, in 2024, nearly 40% of Vietnam total export goes to the US. And about a quarter of Vietnam total imports is coming from China. So, our negotiation team has a big challenge explaining this to the US counterpart. And so the issue of like inspection, transshipment, and CO are always there in the agenda between the US and Vietnam. And in terms of the dependence on the US economy, this is a picture not only about Vietnam, but about other countries in Southeast Asia as well. Vietnam only second to Cambodia in terms of export dependence on the US market. So we all depend on the US market and China markets, but in terms of export, Cambodia is number one, Vietnam is number two, and then Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and so on. And now I'm going to go more specifically into Vietnam's case, because if we look at Vietnam's export data, it has been increased in the last 7 or 8 years since the first Trump terms. But recently, in the first 7 months after the reciprocal tariff, you see the FDIs from China going to Vietnam nearly double, right? And where they go into the area that, both China and Vietnam have, comparative advantage, like textile, chemical, electronics, and metal, and so on and so forth. But if you look more closely, it's not only from China, mainland China, it's also from Hong Kong, right? Because a lot of investment from China to Vietnam is through Hong Kong. And if you look at this, in the last couple of years, the investment from the FDI from China, Hong Kong, and Vietnam increases sharply. And then it's not only from Hong Kong, it's also from Singapore, right? And if you look at the data for the first month of foreign direct investment, Singapore top of the list with 3.4 billion US dollar, China second 2.9. But you add Hong Kong, then Hong Kong and China will be the top of the list. And then if you look a little bit closer, if you look at the top 10 largest newly registered FDI project to Vietnam from Singapore in 2024, actually 5 are from Hong Kong, 5 are from China, and 1 from Hong Kong. So the main point here is we depend so much on China investment now. And this is because of the shift in geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm going to, I have 2 more minutes, so I have to run. Another less discussed but very important issue is the new realignment not only influences or impacts the country politics, but regional politics within the country as well. If you look at this, Vietnam is a long country. It used to be the case that the Southeast region attract nearly half of FDIs. But if you look at this, now the Red River Delta, which is closer to China, receive more than 50% of FDI, Why? Because despite the fact that, multinational firms want to diversify away from China, they still want to be close to China because of the global value chain, because of the big market. So the shift is changing the the bargaining power and the economic power in the country as well. It's not going to be only the country. Okay, so this is the last few slides. So in conclude, I think we are looking, we are confronting a new and more contested and stratified economic alignment, the restructuring of GBC, the new opportunity for ASEAN. But ASEAN face a dilemma, right? Because ASEAN gains are partly a byproduct of US-China rivalry. So depending on whether it's cooling down or it's escalating, we have to adapt and adopt in the new environment. And there's going to be the intra-ASEAN competition and collaboration at the same time. Because as I said before, there might be a race to the bottom for ASEAN countries because we want to take an upper hand in the negotiation with both the US and China. And taking sides now are dangerous for ASEAN, but it seems like both US and China are forcing ASEAN countries to take sides. My final point is we talking about multipolar fragmentation, but mostly from the challenging perspective. But I think that we have opportunity as well, because it will open up other doors. The way Yuan Yang in John Hopkins said, in contrast to the polar crisis, coined by Adam Tooze of Colombia, for example. The second one is because of many overlapping trade agreements, ASEAN country can increase market access, and then there's competing great power offer ASEAN additional incentives and additional leverage as well. And then new sectoral entry points in fragmented value chains. For example, Vietnam and Malaysia now find itself having opportunity in semiconductor, for example. It was not the case only a few years ago. And then the room for ASEAN to shape rules and standards, because collectively ASEAN is a big group in the region, and collectively we can have the bargaining power vis-a-vis China and Russia. But we need to overcome the collective decision making within ASEAN and try to avoid the race to the bottom. So I'm going to stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
I'm still digesting what I've learned from their presentations, and I will try and weave in a little bit of follow-up and questions for my fellow panelists in advance of the Q&A as well, if that's possible. I guess I want to start by putting a suggestion on the table, which is that when we think about the current situation, and as we look at Southeast Asia and try to sort of make an assessment of regional responses to these challenges, it strikes me that two belated insights from economists might be quite helpful at this point. The first insight is the satisfied with mics that don't quite work. That there aren't perfect solutions or perfect choices in the policy world in this context. For those of us coming out of a sort of geopolitics point of view, we do de facto bring to our analyses that there are correct choices and wrong choices, right? But in this rapidly shifting environment, there are only choices that satisfies between seeming suboptimal options. So satisficing as one concept, from the economists that I think may be quite helpful. The second one, again, is a very belated reckoning by our economist colleagues about the fact of imperfect information, right? And this again is a reminder that's so necessary in this current time, as events unfold rapidly, as policymakers try to make decisions without really any sort of foundational good knowledge about the parameters of change they might be confronted with tomorrow in the case of Trump. So the reality of trying to make decisions in a context of completely imperfect information is fairly extreme at the moment. So in that context of having to satisfy in the face of imperfect information, I think it's also useful for us to remind ourselves of general Southeast Asian approaches to economics and security that have persisted prior to the contemporary crisis that we're kind of addressing, focusing on here. My take on Southeast Asian approaches to political economy has been that we've tended to see, in any case, a somewhat pick and choose, non-zero sum. Let's try to be involved in as much as we can, and let's not try to reconcile them, but let's try and find as many opportunities in these multiple channels as possible. That's my sort of quick summary of the political economic side of the story. That doesn't always work, of course. That has led to problems before, but that's been a general approach. Listening to my two fellow panelists, it occurs to me that they come down slightly different for Southeast Asia in dealing with the current fast evolving changes that we're looking at. I think Helen is slightly less optimistic, or slightly more pessimistic, perhaps, in laying emphasis on the narrowing room for what she calls, after quick change trade, multi-alignment tendencies of Southeast Asian countries. Dr. Wu places more emphasis on, the need to think about opportunities, regardless of the current short-term difficulties of adjustments. And he actually, I found very useful his last slide, in which he took the time to spell out some of these potential opportunities that might be pursued down the line. My sense is that if Southeast Asian economies and countries prove themselves successful in grasping only some of these opportunities, not all of them, we might, in some, if they were fairly successful at that, in some see the rise again of what we used to call the trading state. Some of us call them the mercantilist states, right, in the Asian context. In other words, state actors and states focused primarily on the business of garnering profit, on the business of leveraging, right, economic relations and capacity at the expense of what we might regard as traditional geopolitical goals. So the potential rise of trading mercantilist states, and in parallel at the domestic level, the intensification of various kinds of capitalism that we've seen labels put to, crony capitalism, ceasefire capitalism, resource frontier exploitation, etc. Right. So in that sense, I guess I come more in line with the second sort of side of the spectrum that sees certain opportunities and paths of going forward in this that will see the elevation of fundamental economic concerns on the regional landscape. Now, is this a realignment of priorities among Southeast Asian countries? I don't think so. I think this sort of thing has always been a priority for Southeast Asian countries. It's just that those of us who've tended to look at Southeast Asia with a geopolitical lens have tended not to emphasize that part of the story. So, that's one response to, well, are we seeing realignment? Well, to some extent, reinforcement of prevailing fundamental imperatives, I think. Now, the other thing which, I'd like to sort of put before you is that I guess there's a need to get the means and ends relationship right to some extent when we try to situate Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis the United States and China. I think it is absolutely true to say like that as for elsewhere in the world, US hegemony in the region is underpinned by very deep economic investment, trading ties, and until recently, very favorable asymmetric market access, right? In that sense, plus the US remains, as we saw from Dr. Wu's slides, the most the most important external final market for much of the exporters in the region, and also the most important cumulative investor in the region. There's no getting around this, regardless of where China has moved from its relatively low starting point as an economic partner for the rest of the region. Now, what this means is that the US is not just a security provider in the region, right? It is that economic partner and security provider. On the contrary, it is China, right, which in recent decades has become just the major economic partner, right? So there's an asymmetry of importance there for the region that is not often put that way, right? More often we think about the separation of the two realms. They're not separate, but it is China that has that economic profile, which the US also has in a slightly different way, plus the security profile. So that, I think, helps to put into the context some of the decisions which both Helen and Tuan, if I may call you that, have fleshed out for us in the Vietnam and Malaysia cases to some degree. Having said that, though, as I said at the very beginning, I think for Southeast Asia, the economics is foundational. It's not a just issue, right? So given that the economic realm is multifaceted, complex, and of fundamental importance for Southeast Asian countries, the external security realm actually derives its importance from the need to protect that economic imperative. Please turn off your mobile phone, whoever it is. Thanks. Now, this is important because it's distinct from the geopolitics assumption that the external security realm is somehow fundamental for some ideological or abstract balance of power reason. Right? That's not the same rationale when you say that the external security realm derives its importance from the need to protect the economic imperative. Right? This creates different choice parameters for actors who operate with that mindset or assumption or operating framework. Now, having sort of laid that sort of foundation, I hope I'm trying to bridge some of the geopolitics, geoeconomics thinking by doing this. Let me say a couple of things about the adjustments. I like to call them adjustments rather than realignments, because I don't know if they're realignments yet, that we can observe in Southeast Asia to date. Of course, the time series is quite short, so some of this is speculative, and certainly I'm not drawing any conclusions yet. The first set of adjustments I like to call diversification redux, I think. As you all know, diversification is a very big theme in Southeast Asia, whether we're talking about security or economics. And I think we're all fairly familiar with the reasons for that. And when we look at, the evolution of the landscape over the past 2 years, 2 to 3 years, it seems to me that we are seeing an intensification of efforts to diversify across the geoeconomic realm. Now, the success of these efforts remains to be seen, but the efforts are clear. So this has already been referred to, that wider meshing of politics and economics, seen in the way in which some of the Southeast Asian countries have overcome decades of resistance to the idea of aligning with particular geoeconomic blocks, now applying, be part of BRICS on the one hand, and Tuan already referred to this. Indonesia, as we know, has joined, has been accepted as full member at the beginning of this year, with Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam also, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam also applying. At the same time, of course, Indonesia and Thailand have applied for membership in OECD as well, right? Now, traditionally, the two blocks, you know, representing opposing blocs and Southeast Asian economies just not wanting to get involved. But that parallel application, some claim, you know, is a continued effort to pursue that kind of multi-alignment in this shifting context. Now, if we look at more country-specific efforts at diversification, and we combine that with what's already been referred to in the sense of the shifting global global supply chains and value chains, we might think about the case of Indonesia, for example, right, where in the last couple of years, what we've seen is a really deepening state-wide, state-led effort to diversify Indonesia's economic profile and role in critical mineral supply chains, right? Some of this is circumstantial, some of it is opportunism, given the current geo-economic rivalries. So lifting out of the initial emphasis on Chinese investment to build Indonesia's smelting processing base, right, in these critical mineral industries, we see over the past year or two, you know, renewed new Indonesian engagement with the US for minerals, really an effort Jakarta to almost with the US on critical minerals as being of security imperatives very clearly. So that securitization of these sectors is very much present. But of course, at the same time, we see in Indonesia the effort to attract new investment from other actors beyond the US and China, including French, Airma is what I'm thinking of, South Korean, Alex, EcoPro, etc., in these sectors. And a renewed effort really to exert state over this vital securitized sector now, with the Indonesian Sovereign Wealth Fund taking a leading role in coordinating these investments. So when you look at it as moving out of the initial reliance on China and trying to diversify away from it, you know, we will see, I think, some of these critical sectors efforts at continued sort of moving. So the turn towards the US in a way is part of diversification as well as a response to the geopolitical rivalries. Now, the second form of adjustment I'd like to draw attention to, I think, is what I, again, want to call, you know, node hub redux, right? Now, you've all heard me, I think, go on about how Southeast Asia is a crossroads. And it's really, really important to understand the crossroads nature of Southeast Asia. And given that the most important geo-economic shift that we've seen in the last couple of years has been the continued sort of redistribution, right, if you like, of critical supply chains away from over-reliance on China towards multiple destinations, including Southeast Asia, but also places like Mexico, right, proximity to the major markets. There is a new phase of invention in these, you know, reorientated supply chains, I think. On the one hand, of course, yes, it is that diversification point, moving away from initial China plus one type strategy of relocating parts of critical supply chains outside of China into proximate areas to reduce risk. But we're in a new phase of seeing in critical sectors the beginnings, right, of the buildup of parallel apparently politically insulated capacity, right, in friendly states. So the friendshoring issue, right? So this is an additive de-risking type of architecture, right, that the US particularly is trying to build, rather than a pure redistribution outside of the old China-centered supply chains. Now, this is where areas of opportunity, I guess, right, arise for Southeast Asia. Some of this is these are treacherous waters. Some of the dilemmas that again in Tuan's first slide I found fascinating, right? Of the dilemmas. On the one hand, of catching this wave, and on the other hand, of not getting sucked into it and going down under because of over response in a way. But again, you can see this both at a regional level and when you look at individual countries as well. Helen has touched on the Malaysia case, and you know, if I could sort of think about a particular industry in which some of your general remarks might be sort of help to zoom into. If we think about Malaysia's growing efforts to position itself, you know, as a midstream hub in US-aligned EV critical minerals, for example, which is something I'm sure you know much more about than I do. You know, there are ideas that there will be selective areas, including Malaysia and Southeast Asia, that will become vital friendshoring hubs for the US, stretching from sort of Australia through to Malaysia, through to Japan, as this critical supply arc, if you like, coming up this area of the Western Pacific. But we might also think about advanced chip manufacturing, another vital critical area in which Southeast Asia similarly profits and faces significant risks in catching that wave of US tightened export controls on things like on advanced chips, right, to exports to China. Now, Southeast Asian economies currently find themselves in this unenviable situation of, one, being an attractive offshore platform for the Chinese who would like to circumvent US export controls in various ways by using Southeast Asian locations, platforms, and sectors. And on the other hand, being a fairly attractive potential option for the US as new partners in the setting up of that parallel, right, supply chain. Now, a lot of the US engagement takes place in terms of governance policing, right? We now have an interesting challenge of Indonesia, Malaysia, and others, and Singapore as well, trying to demonstrate themselves as effective corridors that can be reliably patrolled, right, to cede to US regulations, or rather, more accurately, to Trump regulations and demands, right? And as a result, being able then to attract the promises of new US investments and relocations in these sectors. Now, to me, the interesting twist to this is the extent to which these economies might be able, as they would hope, right, to have their cake and to eat it too. The extent to which it might be possible in the short to medium term to find ways of catching both of these waves and to avoid, right, the dangers that come with them. It's not clear to me that this is possible, but it's pretty clear to me that this is what Southeast Asian countries will try to do. So again, the reiteration of the importance of Southeast Asia as a crossroads, but forms, all right, is what I find as an element of the part of the geoeconomics that we're seeing today. Now, I have 0 minutes left, and as a segue into the discussion we're going to have, I'll put a question on the table for my panelists and others to think about, which is whether we can add to the points that have been sort of raised so far, and by helping me to think through this issue of, we've always had the danger, haven't we, of lumping Southeast Asia. We make the assumption that we can talk about the region as a whole somehow. We also have the danger of lumping national economies, right? Tuan already showed very clearly that if you think about import and exports, that already gives you a very different picture of dependency, right? With China as the main, import source and the US as the main export destination for Vietnam. Now, to what extent can we disaggregate the lumping in ways that help us to understand, right, how Southeast Asia might variously be positioned in these changes that we're discussing today? Is a question that I'm personally very interested in and would rely on your expertise to help shed light on this. Thank you very much.
in front in the chairs there. I'll be chairing from here. I think it's easier for me to look at the entire room to ensure I get kind of raise hands a lot. So the usual rules, if you have a question, do raise your hand, identify yourself briefly, and also the most important part, make your question curt and pointed, and please do restrain it to only one question per person. Can I take three first, since we have three panelists, and can I have a show of hands, anyone who has a question? Tommy? Anyone else? Oh, there's a lady there. And one more. Can I have another one? So that, yep, the gentleman in the middle. So Tommy first, and then the lady on right side, and Tommy, and the gentleman there. So the microphones, please.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and the speakers for kicking start this really fascinating panel on realignments. So I have a specific question for Professor NESADURAI, which may also be relevant for the other speakers. So Professor NESADURAI, so you mentioned that Malaysian policymakers increasingly view integration into Western critical minerals supply chains as essential to national prosperity. But how is prosperity defined domestically? Who determines which foreign partners count as beneficial? So the question is really about, whether Malaysia's supply chain choices primarily a geopolitical calculus, or are they being shaped more by specific elite industry coalition who may stand to benefit? And I was thinking, in that process, would you see critical minerals as kind of creating a new class of domestic winners and potentially contributing to new kinds of global inequalities? Thank you.
Can I have the lady there? Yeah. Microphone, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I think the first two speakers touched on this, but I would like to go into it a bit further, the response of ASEAN as a bloc to the Trump tariffs, and how you would assess that, given the sort of the split in what member states wanted out of this, and whether you see this becoming an entrenched problem for ASEAN as a bloc as the balance of power gets, I don't know, more heated in the years ahead.
The gentleman in the brown blazer. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Gerald Chan from Auckland. I have a simple question to Professor Ko. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned about advanced chips. And in the same sort of line, you also mentioned about the US investments, probably in ASEAN countries. I'm just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit about that. US denying advanced chips to China and US investments in ASEAN. What's the connections there? Thank you.
Do you want to start from the speaker? Evelyn first? Helen, okay. Do you want to start first?
So I'm going to discuss the second question and touch upon a little bit on the last one, because it's actually addressed to Evelyn. So the first question is about, the second question is about the whether ASEAN can be seen as a bloc, unified bloc in the relationship with great powers. And my question is, we as ASEAN countries talk a lot about ASEAN as an unified bloc, but in reality, we are quite fragmented. So this also refers back to the issue that Evelyn, asked at the end of her presentation about whether we should, or we can, to what extent can we disintegrate ASEAN, as a lumping group together. I guess, as I mentioned in my presentation, when Trump started imposing reciprocal tariffs on countries, and within ASEAN, I don't see an effort by the leadership to get together as a way to uh, somehow counter that reciprocal tariff or find a common or collective solution um, as a bloc. And I know that this year Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN, and I was in KL a few days ago, and clearly I see a lot of efforts by ASEAN to bring ASEAN countries together, but the motivation of individual countries will break that. So as I mentioned, there's a race to the bottom. Every leaders in ASEAN try to get into the line, to have a phone call with Trump rather than getting together to discuss how to move forward and how to collectively negotiate with Trump. I don't see that. So I guess it's really hard to. But and two other things. One is, ASEAN is diverse. If you put like Singapore together with Myanmar and Brunei, for example, it's very diverse with very different interests and motivation. So it's really hard to find a common voice and common grounds in each and every issues, and that make ASEAN relatively weak in collective, decision making and negotiation. And the second thing is in many different uh, areas, ASEAN countries are actually competing with each other in electronics, in EVs, in semiconductors, and so on, textile and garments. So that again, um, leave ASEAN in many situations, you know, having to deal with internal issues before can come out as an unified bloc. So I think this, in conclusion, I think we really want ASEAN to be strong. We really want ASEAN to become EU in the 90s, not now. but but really, I don't see an easy way to get there, given all the things I discussed. And finally, the final point: ASEAN's countries, in many cases, see themselves and still have the mentality coming out of the colonial periods. I think that is deep down inside, we still think of European, the US, and so on, are kind of superimposing their will on ASEAN. I think we really need to free ourselves from that mentality. And of course, we need the view and the perspective from the other side as well, because so far ASEAN countries see themselves as, passively react to what great powers are imposing on them, right? Less as an active players in this game, trying to actively and proactively counterbalance, getting together, mobilize, forces and so on and so forth. I don't see that, at least for now. I think we need to change that mentality. Otherwise, I don't see ASEAN as an unified strength and bloc that can help ASEAN countries as a association of Southeast Asia country, but at the same time don't see its status in the world or in the region as a significant bloc. Probably I should stop here.
Let me just answer Tommy's question first and then more generally. I think your first question was on how is our policy on supply chains and so on addressed. Actually, it's hard to tell, but very definitely big business are part of it. There's a lot of consultation with chambers of commerce, for instance. Businesses do have policy inputs, even scholars. What's really interesting is a year ago, I did speak to some scholars who were involved in parliamentary hearings on things like semiconductors. And their view was that, oh dear, we seem to be really, really aligned to China. This year, it's different. The same person said, I'm shocked. So imperfect information, we don't know. And I suspect, as you said, the countries are struggling to find their feet because I think the past decade or so, more than that, has been very comfortable for us. We have been able to gloss over our differences. The lack, the ASEAN way comes back again. We have been able to manage very well. But now, I also agree with you, there is no unified strategy because we are all competing. We were competing in labor-intensive products, and then now we're going to be competing in all these high-tech, critical minerals. Indonesia has a strategy for that, EV as well, semiconductors. Maybe we have an advantage given the longer history here, but anything can change. And it's also whether countries do have the supporting infrastructure to support this high-tech. In Malaysia, for instance, we've always said that we haven't restructured our economy into a more high-skilled, we've relied a lot on migrant labor. So that's the state of play. And yeah, I would just echo what you've said about ASEAN needing to, I think, move forward in a more unified way. But having said that, I'm not so sure whether that is going to be possible, not just because of the differences in ASEAN, but also because what's out there, what will the US and China demand? And so that is a double constraint. It's a constraint from the lack of this kind of collaborative, really serious collaboration into a bloc, if you will, or at least a more coordinated geo-economic space. But also, what are these two countries going to demand? That's a big question mark.
Just to focus on Gerald's question, there's obviously a longer story here, but it does, of course, stem from the Biden era, clampdown on the export of NVIDIA-class chips to China, right? That then created opportunities for proximate economies to China, the ones in Southeast Asia, of responding to Chinese requirements for alternative routings and repackagings, let's put it that way, and repurposings of US origin advanced chips routed through Southeast Asia, whether it's data centers, et cetera, and then ultimately to China, right? So that's been like the first phase of sort of opportunistic response to to a hole in the market, created by the U.S. controls. Now, of course, under the Trump administration, that's put certain Southeast Asian economies that have been doing this under scrutiny from the U.S. Part of the whole Trump, decoupling process. Now we're thinking about things like the U.S. investigations into Singapore's role, right, in helping with this kind of diversion, right, of controlled chips to China. We're thinking about some voluntary responses from Malaysia, right, new trade directives that that respond to the U.S. Demands by imposing, advance notification for the export, transshipment, transit of high-performance AI chips of U.S. origins to anywhere else in the world. Efforts like this to kind of demonstrate that these economies that the U.S. is concerned about as diversion loopholes, can tighten up these loopholes on behalf of the U.S. Now, the strategic element of this is that in demonstrating that they are able to respond to U.S. concerns, countries like Malaysia are hoping then to be able to benefit from the sort of thing that Helen talked about, right? The easing of the way towards Malaysia's ability to benefit from the promise of the setting up of these alternative supply chains, friendshoring points in vital sectors. So the two things are connected in that sense. But at the same time, the Chinese requirements for so-called diversion routes still are there and are still being responded to some way or the other. So that's what I'm saying. Right? It's an interesting moment of opportunity, but fraught with difficulty when we think about this from a governance standpoint. It reminds me of a debate that we used to have in the 80s and the 90s when Southeast Asian countries were navigating between trade blocs, right, that looked like they were going to be set up as alternative zero-sum trade blocs. So the APEC versus ASEAN plus 3 or whatever the precursor of that was, and the ways in which certain economies managed over time to negotiate their terms of their membership of these trade blocs to actually belong to all of them at the same time. So there's a slight resonance of that for me. I know that the analogy is not perfect, but we'll see what comes out of this. Thanks.
Yep, we have 3 minutes before our tea, but I can allow for one more burning question. Anyone? Minso? So just one, and then can I ask the panelists to sort of keep it short and round, and then we can have more discussion during tea.
Thanks. Mingson, PhD in ANU CAP, the CAP. Just one question. I think this one is also quite implied by the panel as well. How do intra-ASEAN and intra-regional trade and political dynamics figure in this shifting array of geo-economic strategies? From the panel, I get the feel that the ASEAN member states are deeply enmeshed with global production, more so than with each other. But as you mentioned, that these economies are very differentiated and unequal. They can compete, but they also can complement each other as by the SEZs throughout the region. Some are successful, like Singapore. Some are not, like Thailand's ACMEC and Vietnam's DTA. Do these intra-regional dynamics matter in these geo-economic strategies, or more of an afterthought, squeezed out by great power competition in this area? Thank you.
I will try to respond to your question and just end with sort of just thinking aloud. Maybe if we thought about it in functional terms. I think this happened, so I think the old term was regionalization, not regionalism top down, so, through companies and so on. And you did see these in terms of the supply chains like Toyota's, brand-to-brand complementation and so on, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. So I'm just wondering whether that might be a way that companies choose what they do in relation to supply chains across Southeast Asia. So it's not country and not an integrated huge space, but through the supply chain connections, and somehow the governance will work itself out. Well, bottom up, but also top down, because it makes sense. So it's just some thinking aloud.
I think if you look at it across the region, there is some argument for this, right? Because there is functional comparative advantage differentiation. But within each of these categories, of course, there is competition. So if you think about it, Indonesia and Philippines, upstream minerals, right? Malaysia and Vietnam, midstream electronics up to this point, that could change. Thailand, capacity for, say, if we're thinking about EVs assembly. Singapore, services, finance, logistics. So there is functional differentiation. There are potentials there. And, there are consultancies that play up this idea that we might have, a single chain dominance and collaborative symbiosis. I'm kind of quoting here, consultancy language, but that might eventually come to pass because of this differentiation. Like I said, you get the competition that Helen refers to within each of these layers, but there is functional differentiation.
I just want to add one more thing. On that Helen and Evelyn was talking about, just one more thing, which is ASEAN countries share a quite similar wish list, like semiconductor, data center, and AI, and so on and so forth. But depending on the capacity, both state capacity and corporation capacities, then each country will have a different ability to respond to the opportunity that introduce themselves either by the conflict between superpowers or by the selection of multinational corporations as a destination for their investment. So once again, I want to reemphasize that we are in the transition from reactive mode to more proactive mode, but depending on internal capabilities. And then, it can be realized as an opportunity or it's just something that potential that we can never grasp.
Thank you to the three panels. I hope you find this, like myself, very satisfying or satisfying, and that they have done the heroic task of trying to work out a situation where they are looking at players who are acting with imperfect information. So it's double imperfect information in that sense. So please join me with thanking the panels.